Buenas noches, bienvenidos a la conferencia magistral del neurólogo francés, el Dr. Lionel Naccache, titulada ¿Es el mundo epiléptico? Analogía entre el microcosmos cerebral y el macrocosmos social. Naccache es neurólogo e investigador en neurociencia cognitiva y además profesor de fisiología en la Universidad Pierre y Marie Curie, además de neurólogo y neurofisiólogo en el Hospital Pitié-Salpêtrière, París. Es investigador en neurociencia cognitiva en el Instituto del Cerebro y Médula Espinal. En 2013 fue nombrado como miembro del Comité Nacional de Ética. Sus obras están dedicadas a la exploración de las propiedades psicológicas y las bases neuronales de la conciencia. En su trabajo se cruzan varios enfoques complementarios que incluyen la experiencia clínica de pacientes con trastornos neurológicos o psiquiátricos, así como el estudio de la cognición del cerebro. Bienvenido, Dr. Naccache. Es un honor contar con su presencia en el ALEPH. Adelante.
Hi to everyone. I'm extremely glad, very happy to be part of this festival, of this ALEPH festival, and I would like first to thank the organizers, and in particular José Gordon and all the team for this invitation. So I'm very happy also to present you this conference during the next 50 minutes. And as you will see, the title I'm using is quite provocative, is the word epileptic. And so I'm going to try to play the game of this edition of the ALEPH Festival, Fronteras de la Medicina, by trying to go beyond the frontiers of the current way of thinking medicine or the relation between medicine and society. But you will see so that my conference will deal with an analogy. So trying to use the mode of analogy, trying to explore new questions, or better to ask all questions, but to see them different way, and to enter into a kind of dialectic between two levels. And I will try to introduce them to you very briefly as an introduction, between the microcosm of your brain, so the communication within each of our brains, and that's the microcosmic level, so I will call it the micro, and with the communication at the macrocosm level of society, of contemporary society. So I invite you, if you want to follow me, to go into this kind of analogical mode of reasoning to compare the brain and society. And of course, we will try to take a lot of precautions to be rigorous and trying to take the advantage of the analogy, but not to take the disadvantages of it. And I will try to explain that better in a few seconds. So first, let me introduce a little bit more my talk. So I will try to play the game of an analogy, not only between the brain and society, but more precisely between the communication within the brain, so within the brain microcosm, and communication within society, within the societal macrocosm. And to help you also, I will try to use both symbols. You can see on the left a brain, a lateral view of the brain. And when you will see this symbol on my slides, it will mean that we are trying to go, during this analogy, on the brain level. And sometimes we will jump to the society level. So this will help you also to follow my conference and my slides. I will precisely tell you where we are in this analogy, because we will jump in the two directions. So we will jump from the brain properties of communication and we try to project them, to project some of our results to the way society works. And once we will enlighten the way we can understand or enlighten some of aspects of this communication in societies, we will try to go back to the brain. And so you see, we will use these loops, and that's the pleasure of using analogy to connect two apparently distinct levels, the brain and society, and trying by this analogy and comparison, these back and forth loops, trying to extract new ideas or to ask new questions. So first you may ask, why such an analogy? Why should we compare communication in the brain and communication in society? So that will be the first point of my talk. And to do that, we have to go deep into the brain. So of course, many of you are familiar at least with some aspects of neuroscience. So I did not introduce myself. I'm a neuroscientist, a neurologist, and I'm working on consciousness, what we call cognitive neuroscience of consciousness, both in healthy people and in patients, in human patients. So what you can see here is one neuron. Of course, all of you recognize this neuron. And this is a representation of a neuron, of course, from the great Ramon y Cajal, as you know, who was the founder of what we call the neuronal doctrine or the neuron theory. In a way, he understood by the beginning of the 20th century what we could call a kind of individualism of the brain, meaning that our brain is made of elementary cells called the neurons, which are communicating together, but they communicate together by keeping their individuality. So you have distinct neurons, and this is very important. Actually, the Nobel Prize was offered to Cajal for this discovery, whereas some other great scientists like Golgi thought that the brain is kind of a, we could say, an approximation, one single cell, a reticular network without clear frontiers and without clear delimitation between the cells. So we have a great organ made of neurons. And each of these neurons, as you can say, has a cell body, like cells. And in the cell body, you have the nucleus of the cell, for instance, and you have this dendritic tree. So the place, we could say, to approximate where all the other neurons will send some messages to this given neuron. And as you know, some of the neurons communicating with one neuron are sending excitatory information, so trying to activate the neuron, and some other are projecting inhibitory synapses, like we call them. And in a way, not to caricature too much, you can say that the life of a neuron is like a permanent pole, receiving votes and taking the decision. Of course, it's not a voluntary decision, but taking the decision, do I stay at the resting state of the neuron, or do I engage in an activation mode we call the action potential? And when it is the case, the action potential propagates from the cell body to the axon, through the axon to the termination of the neuron. And there, at this point, all the prolongation of the axon are projecting and communicating with other neurons. And of course, as you know that, what is absolutely gigantic in this kind of process is that one neuron is approximately communicating on average, we say, with something like 10,000 other neurons. So you can begin to see the complexity of the network. And actually, of course, you don't have a single neuron in your brain, but you have something like 80 to 100 billion neurons. And if you multiply that with the number of synapses, you come up with this huge power of 10 of synapses that you can have like more than 10 times at the power of 12 or 13. So that's a very complex network. You can see an image of it. So why do I say that? Just to introduce by saying, okay, there is no question. If we consider the brain as the most complex object in nature, it's because the architecture of its communication network is huge. It's very difficult to deal with because you have this wonderful complexity. So that's for the brain, okay. But then we could jump to society. And of course, the communication between societies and inside societies, it's much more a socio-cultural construct. So the scale, the temporal scale is not the same. And what I would like to introduce is to say that our contemporary networks, social networks, and when I say social networks, I mean social networks, physical networks, but also, of course, even the virtual networks with all the tools that we know. So just to introduce you to this notion that today communication networks in societies, in most societies, is very complex. So we reach not a similar, but a high complexity both in the brain, but also in society. A nice way to illustrate it is to show you this short video. I will show it to you in a few seconds, just to tell you first, what you will see, it's extracted from a paper published in Science a few years ago by Schick and colleagues. So what you will see here, it's a clever mode to quantify the organization of societies and communication between societies. How does it work? You will see a map of Europe, as you can see, and you will see the time from the last 2,000 years. And what they did in this marvelous paper, they built an Excel sheet, and they took names of popular people, great politicians, great warriors, great thinkers, great artists, great poets, great mathematicians, etc. So they took personalities, if you want, so very famous people in their period of time. And they tried to draw a trajectory for each of these individuals. So you will see a trajectory going from the place where they were born in blue, and it will change to the place where they died. And the logic behind is to say you can be born almost anywhere according to the density of people. But when you will turn to be a very important people in your society, most probably you will die in the place where you worked the most, where you did your great things. So the trajectory will inform us about the place that was important for societies of each period. And so what you will see now, and I will just send the movie, is this dynamics of complexity of European networks, but the same has been also made for the American continent in the same paper. And just to illustrate my point, and just remember, it's a very nice movie to see. Each of the trajectory is one life of a famous individual. So I let you see. Of course, it's 2,000 years ago, so the most important places are Roma, the empire, Roman Empire, and Athens, of course, of the Greek Empire. And now I'll let you see, and you can see the time here in years, and you will see the progressive buildup of these complex social networks and communication networks. And we speak only of the physical ones between the great cities, the great places. You will see that some countries like France will move to a very centralized with Paris. And at this time, you see 10th century, Paris is here. It's not big. It's Lyon is a much more important city. But you will see that other countries that what will turn to become Germany will respect a modularity of the different regions and different cities. So we are at the 15th century now, and you see it's a huge complex network that you can see. And of course, America is discovered, so you have people moving and emigrating from UK, from Spain, of course, Portugal to the American continent. And we are almost there here. And we stop in 2011 at the end of this article. So if you compare the first image and this one, of course, you can see that my first point seemed to be okay. We can consider that there is a complex network of communication within your brain, but also a complex network of communication in contemporary societies. So that was for the first point, okay? This, not similar, but we can compare two complex systems of communication. So let's move. So if we want to compare these two, then you have to understand my title. Why did I refer to epileptic society? It's not to try to induce a fear or to freeze your thoughts. It's something else. So let's begin with something. And actually, this conference is inspired by a book that is not yet translated in Spanish or in English. I will tell you later. And I began this reflection by what I call the paradox of the stationary journey. So what do I mean by that? I mean that there is a paradox today that traveling, and I mean physical traveling, but you could apply what I'm going to say also to virtual traveling, but physical traveling has never been today more easy. It's easy to take a plane and to move even to Mexico City. Unfortunately, we can't do this. So my slide is quite strange because after 1 year of pandemic, it's not really in the area, but of course, we hope that we will go back, maybe not to the same stages, but to comparable for this point. So traveling has never been more easy, fast, cheap, safe, and secure. So, okay, so traveling is easy. You can move easily. But more and more, and that was my paradox, when you move from one place of the planet to another one, you take a plane, you just 5 or 6 hours later, you are somewhere else, so it should be completely different. But more and more, when you travel, you are left with the subjective experience that you did not move actually, that you left a place, but you arrive in another place that shares a lot of similarities, if not identities, from the first area. So you have this strange, like as if you did not move, what I mean by stationary journey, voyage immobile in French. And so, of course, I do not say that it's always the case, but more and more you have this feeling. And for instance, if I can give one illustration, as a parent, when you move and you go to give a conference somewhere else, you are very pleased to take back and to offer some presents to your family, in particular your family, your children. So a few decades ago, it was easy to find some original stuff to buy and to bring back because you could not find them easily in Paris or in Mexico. But now, more and more, it's a difficult exercise because you find the same shops, the same objects, the same more and more. So what we could say, it's another way of describing some aspects of the globalization. Okay. So if we follow that, so again, it's not systematic, and still we are very happy when we can find some non-stationary journeys. But more and more, the journeys have this slippeing slope or this tendency to be more and more stationary, to obey to this paradox. And I can tell you, of course, the emblematic illustration of the stationary journey, the place which is what I call a reduplication almost of the same place all over the globe, so all over the planet. So welcome to Paris. So what you can see here, it's a fantastic mall. So of course, the commercial mall is for me the emblematic of epilepsy. I will explain this term now. So if you would come to Paris next time when the pandemic is over, I can invite you to this fantastic Parisian place that resembles to no one else, of course, but you could go to Los Angeles, which is completely different. You can go to Tel Aviv or other places, and you can even go, of course, to Mexico City with, I think it's a Liverpool Center, if I chose correctly the slide. But so, of course, the commercial mall is the emblematic reduplication of the same place all over the globe. So you move from Paris to Mexico, but you did not move, actually. Okay. And you see that we were still in a society. So we end up with saying, okay, my paradox of the stationary journey, of the voyage immobile, actually we can analyze it according to the following properties. You have a massive reduplication of many locations. And when you have this massive reduplication, you go up with the following properties. You have hypercommunication between places. So a kind of massive reduplication of locations or places associated with hypercommunication, with a loss of complexity, that you have more and more simple and not very complex or subtle properties. So hypercommunication, loss of complexity, and of course, the most important one, the loss of differentiation. All these places look alike. They did not keep their original personality or their original properties. And that's the point where the analogy begins to be nice to play with. Why? Because we first try to compare, to say we can play the analogy because the two objects are complex. One is micro, the other is macro, but the two are complex. And when we jump into the macro, into society, we begin with this societal symptom, this paradox of the stationary journey. We analyze it and we end up with the following properties. Then we can project these properties into the microcosm level, at the microcosm level, into the brain. And what is nice is that, so I'm a neurologist, that's the reason why I play this game. But the first time I remember very well, when I had this idea, we were discussing together with my wife on a seashore, and in an occasion of massive reduplication of the same place, that could be so very lot of different places. And so we began to discuss, and I told her at one point, but you know, when you have this list of properties, not in society, but in a brain, I mean, hypercommunication, this time between brain location, between cortical areas that communicate too much in a way. And when the message that is communicated is very poor, you have this loss of complexity. And when you have this loss of differentiation, meaning that, you know, usually in your cortex, you have specialized cortical networks, and it's not the case that all the brain is doing the same thing. Otherwise, you would not be conscious, actually. So when you have hypercommunication, loss of complexity, and loss of differentiation, not in society, but in the brain, it's called an epileptic seizure. So an epileptic seizure is exactly what I described from the macrocosm level. So that's the reason why I was asking the question, if this paradox of the stationary journey, which is not systematic, but which is a contemporary phenomenon, is related to these properties, and that these properties correspond to an epileptic seizure in the brain, we end up with a new analogy to propose that we could describe some aspects of society of communication in societies as some kind of epileptic symptoms, but not at the brain level, but at the society level. So once you're there, you can go and play again more and more with this analogy, staying in the brain, because you will learn something new from the brain, and we will still do this back and forth. So what is the next step? The next step is the following one. Actually, an epileptic seizure, you can ask a neurologist, and before everything to a patient also, what is the most devastating symptom of epilepsy? So you have a lot of different kinds of epileptic seizures, but the epileptic seizures that are the more problematic for the patients are the ones that are associated with the loss of consciousness. And here I have to take a few minutes to jump to this neurological description, because usually people think that when we describe loss of consciousness, we mean loss of vigilance, the most extreme case corresponding to the comatose state. So someone who is not awake, someone who is not vigilant, who is lying down, eyes closed, and you could not wake him up, what we call comatose state. But actually, of course, when you are in the comatose state, you are not conscious. But for epilepsy, the most devastating point is not that, is a pure loss of consciousness, meaning that some patients, they are still vigilant. What do I mean by vigilant? Is that they are awake. They are not in the comatose state, meaning that they can stand up without falling. They can have their eyes wide open. They can even engage in automatic processes without any voluntary and subjective feeling of wanting to do something. But still, there are, as I said, some sensory motor processes that can still occur. But what is lost in this patient during this transient period? Hopefully it's not systematic, hopefully. But during this transient period of an epileptic seizure with a loss of consciousness, the patient is vigilant. He can still engage in some automatic acts, automatic actions, but he lost what we call the subjective report, the subjective experience. He is not able to self-report to himself what is happening and what is happening to him or to the environment. In another way, if you want to equate consciousness with what we call self-reportability, in a kind of Cartesian definition, to say, I'm conscious because I'm conscious, I'm speaking to a camera, and I hope people will listen to this conference, and I can self-report to myself many things. But sometimes I can be vigilant, a patient can engage in sensory motor action, but he lost this subjective experience. That's what we call loss of consciousness. And in epilepsy, the most devastating symptom is this one. And what is interesting, and this is my area of research for more than 20 years now, is that we could make some progresses. Of course, it's still very complex, but still we can describe the following thing. So I will not describe this model, but it's not that complex, but it would take me too long to describe it now. For the sake of this conference, I will just escape to this description. But basically, we can say that what happens in your brain when you are conscious. So not only when you are vigilant, but when you can engage in this subjective experience of being aware of something, self-reporting to you what is happening. I perceive something, I feel something, I want something, I desire something, I'm doing something, etc. So when you are conscious, it's not that one given area of your brain is working. So consciousness is not located in one part of your cortex, but consciousness corresponds to a kind of brain scale conversation. And this brain scale conversation, we can begin to describe it. It's a complex conversation. It's a differentiated conversation, meaning that it's not the case that all cortical areas are doing the same at the same time. And it's a coherent conversation. And each of these words, we can quantify it with measure on brain activity and corresponding to the psychological properties of being conscious. So when you are conscious, you need to be able to engage, your brain area do engage in this complex, differentiated and coherent conversation occurring at the brain scale from anterior to posterior cortical areas in what we call associative cortices. And just to give you an illustration, we had the opportunity with my colleagues from Marseille, Fabrice Bartholomé and his team, a few years ago to record some epileptic seizures, but from inside the brain. So I will go a little bit faster. You will have here some recordings of brain activity from inside the brain. And these kind of recordings are done for what we call pre-surgical mapping, when you want to propose some kind of surgery for severe epilepsies that are refractory to medications. So in some cases, you can try to explore if there is a surgical solution to propose to the patient. I will not develop it today, but what I mean is that it provides us with the opportunity of recording the brain activity from inside the brain. So with an optimal anatomical precision and temporal precision, what we call spatial resolution and temporal resolution. And what we did with our colleagues, it was an idea I proposed several years ago, is trying to examine the patient second from second. So a very systematic clinical examination to see is the patient still conscious or not. And what we observed, we wanted to know at what point in the epileptic seizure the patient will lose consciousness. Because this kind of patient, you can see they have epileptic seizures beginning in some precise networks, not everywhere. So here, for instance, this patient, you have a recording, and the epileptic seizure its onset is within the temporal lobe, internal face of the temporal lobe, what we call hippocampus. Of course, you know, hippocampus for its importance in memory, in spatial navigation, and so forth. So you can see here, maybe you can see on the screen, you see before, that's the normal recording before the epileptic seizure. You can see here that there is a very dense and fast activity. That's the electrical manifestation of the epileptic seizure onset in the hippocampus. But interestingly, at this stage, the patient is still conscious. He can self-report to himself what is happening, where he is, etc. So he's still conscious. And so then the epileptic seizure in time, so the horizontal axis is time, of course. And so you see that the epileptic seizures, which was located to the temporal lobe, to the hippocampus, then moved also, jumped to another areas in the parietal cortex. And you can see here the propagation of this epileptic seizure from one location to the other one. We are in the brain communication, I described you before. And then at this point, the patient was still conscious. But at one point, precisely, we could really date, at one point, the patient is not conscious clinically. So again, remember what I mean. No conscious meaning eyes wide open, automatic processes, but he's not here anymore. There is no one. What we can call pseudo-absence, pseudo-absence. And what is interesting is that you can see that in accordance with our theory, the patient is losing consciousness when the epileptic seizure propagates in this brain scale network, what we call the global workspace network of consciousness. And interestingly, it means that exactly at this point, this brain scale, rich, complex, differentiated, and coherent conversation suddenly turned to something which was something completely different, a too coherent, a too poor, and undifferentiated brain communication, and that these one are the conditions for the loss of consciousness in a brain. And in a way, you see that this complex conversation moved to a very poor and too coherent, uniform, and indistinct scream in a way, okay? If we want to refer to the Edvard Munch scream, famous painting. So we are ready to jump back once we first identify the stationary journey in society, and then we analyze its properties. And then I told you, oh, it's interesting. These properties correspond to an epileptic seizure in the brain. So we move to the brain and we describe what is an epileptic seizure. And it's true that in a way, an epileptic seizure, if you follow me, I hope you follow me, that I'm clear enough, in the brain, what I'm telling you is that the stationary journey we began with describing society, communication in society, in a way, there is a microcosmic equivalent of this stationary journey. An epileptic seizure is a stationary journey in the brain. It's a hyper-communication, but too poor, undifferentiated reduplication of the way the brain is working. So you see, that's the game of the analogy. So then we can go back to society, that's the interest, another loop, and say, okay, so it means that if you really want to still play the game of the analogy, to go beyond the frontier, like Jose Gordon and his colleagues proposed this year at the ALEPH festival, it means that an unconscious epileptic society, if we accept this analogy, would be a society that is still active. It's not a comatose society, still active, but this society would lose any ability to self-report its own actions and would not be able to self-criticism its own action because this society would not be able to self-report. And of course, would not be able to engage not in automatic processes, but in any strategical change in the way the society would proceed, would work, okay? And I will focus on these points later on. But so you can ask yourself, can we try to play this game and to go to the extreme aspect? What would be the extreme form of such an unconscious epileptic society? Still active, but completely blind to what it is doing. It is performing automatically, without strategy, without self-reporting, without criticism. So I ask you the question, what would be the radical form of such an hypothetic, unconscious epileptic society? It's not very long to think about it. Of course, if you pay attention, in the analogy again, of course, a totalitarian regime would correspond to the criterion we listed here. And so it means that an unconscious epileptic society would correspond to a totalitarian regime. We can examine this hypothesis. Indeed, you have this massive synchronization of minds and brains and this synchronization. So it would be the equivalent of hyper-communication between the places. And it would converge on very rigid and very poor representations through the tools of propaganda. And it's worth noting to remark that, of course, you have a lot of political regimes across history, but totalitarian regime needed some technology to proceed. I mean, the use of massive synchronization of mind, I'm not a historian or a sociologist, of course. We go to the, I'm out of my area of expertise of comfort zone, but that's the game of going beyond the frontiers. But still, you can say, okay, it's interesting. A totalitarian regime needs technical tools to engage into propaganda. So it's not the case that you could do that in antique times, for instance. And the propaganda, for instance, for a long period of time, they used unilateral mass media like press, radio, cinema, TV, in which you can send unidirectionally some messages and trying to have an influence on people. Okay. And in totalitarian regime, you have a loss of individual singularities. I mean, you have this huge literature and history studies about, for instance, in the communist world, what does it mean, the attacks against individual singularities, or in other totalitarian regime, of course. You have the struggle against critical minds. So you can list all these properties here. And of course, you have the shut-off of democratic institutions that would correspond to one of the mechanisms to turn a complex conscious society into an epileptic society, if you follow this analogy. So, and that's very important, not to engage in what I call analogical errors. What we speak about here is not the individual, is a society. Of course, there are some relation between the two, but what I mean is that the loss of consciousness we deal with in this analogy for societies at the macro level is not the loss of consciousness of the individual. The individuals are still conscious, most of them, if they are healthy, and when they wake up the morning there. But the loss of consciousness is a new concept. We could say it's not the individual consciousness, but what we would like to call societal consciousness. So the consciousness not of one individual, but of the society working corresponding to a complex network. So meaning that, again, it's very important not to engage into this error. What I call an unconscious epileptic society is not made of unconscious individuals, okay, you see? And in a way, why am I mentioning that? Because there is some analogical errors. And it's interesting, I would just take one of these. Most probably you know that one of the contemporary phenomenon in cinema, for instance, in the movies, but also in literature and in many also other forms on TV, it's of course the zombie movies phenomenon. If you pay attention to this very important phenomenon, so since the famous Romero movies, but we have plenty other one, Land of the Dead, and we could add a lot of zombie movies from everywhere, of course. And you have in any country, in France, La Horde is a very interesting movie variation of the thematics, Train to Busan. I will not develop. Of course, you have some also bestsellers or like huge movies, I mean, in terms of commercial or of diffusion. Of course, you have even variations. You have funny movies about zombies, etc. You have these Walking Dead TV shows that you know all everywhere in the globe, and you have these zombie walks, and I could develop it. But what is interesting is that for me, you know, the zombie phenomenon is not a new one. You have some paintings, you have some writings. You can find trace of evidence of the zombie concept like 400 years ago. So it's interesting to explain why is it so popular now. And my claim, my hypothesis, according to this analogy, would be that in a way, some people anticipated my analogy, but they committed the error of thinking that the loss of consciousness of societies would propagate to the individual level. Because in a way, you could say a zombie movie is a movie in which you deal with the loss of consciousness of a society, but corresponding to the loss of consciousness of each of its individuals, which is, of course, not what I propose here. What I propose here is consciousness of societies, not of the individuals. I think, I hope this point is clear because it's important, and we could discuss, hopefully, next time we meet physically. So again, to be clear, an unconscious epileptic society is not made of unconscious individuals. Okay. But of course, of conscious individuals whom conscious contents, so the content of their consciousness, are shaped by the unconscious epileptic society. And of course, it's very important, even for ethical aspects, for moral aspects of the responsibility of individuals in such regimes or totalitarian structures. Okay. So at this point, I think I'm speaking since 35 minutes or so, if you are still listening. So you could say, okay, so this French scientist tried to propose this analogy between society and the brain, and going in complex circularities between communication in the brain, in the neural networks, and in society across time, and then to extrapolate to all my conference or what I said so far. So, and I end up with a proposal that in a way, active defense of democracy is mandatory to societal consciousness. So if you want a society to be conscious, it seems, according to the properties I listed here, if you play the game of analogy, and when I wrote this book, I did not know where I wanted to arrive. So it was just a game of thinking, a game of thought. So you could say, okay, so all this strange and complex and unusual way of thinking to tell me in the end, you have to defend democracy. So I can list to you, or I can imagine what you could think, or you could say, okay, such a complex, such a long digression to end up with this very trivial and basic results that we can obtain from many other way of thinking. We don't need to engage in your analogy to propose that active defense of democracy is mandatory to societal consciousness, even if we define it rigorously, what we call societal consciousness. So at this point, you could say, okay, we have to define education, access to culture and critical thinking, freedom of expression, separation of powers, since Montesquieu, etc. You know all the story, independence of justice and media, etc. So protection of citizen rights. So you could say that, you could say, okay, you are listing here something we don't need your analogy. We don't need to be brain experts to think about that. So at this point, my comment to your question, or to your commentary that I imagine or simulate or anticipate, is to say, when through very different ways, very different approaches, you end up and you converge on the very same result. Two options. You could say, I don't need your complex, I don't need your complex way of thinking because I don't need it. I can obtain the same result with some other approaches, more classical ones, and more expert in history, in sociology, etc., in politics. But the other option is to say, you know, when you converge to the same result through very different ways, maybe it means that the result is really important and that you really need it. Of course, I favor the second option because otherwise I don't really have reason to speak today with you, but that's a proposal. Okay, so I would like to make some other comments before concluding. This analogy is not a pessimistic analogy. And I would like to make this point very clear and very strong. Why it is not a pessimistic analogy? First, because when you say that you can lose consciousness and that a society can lose consciousness, it means that the society before was conscious. So it means that maybe there are some ways of recovering consciousness. And more precisely, you know, I try to expose it very briefly, but still, that what we know in the brain is that to be conscious requires a highly complex physical and functional architecture of the brain. But the same can be said for society, according to this analogy. In other terms, what I mean is that if a society is able to lose consciousness, according to my analogy, it means that also the positive aspect of the phenomenon is that the society can access to consciousness, to this conscious, the societal consciousness, and because of its highly complex networks of communication. And in a way, it means that we are in a kind of unprecedented time, according to which we reach a level of complexity in societies that enables both an unprecedented level of consciousness of societies, but also, of course, the reverse side, unprecedented loss of consciousness by epilepsy. So to say that my analogy is not pessimistic intrinsically, it provides some way of analyzing and maybe some also possibilities to not to cure epilepsy of the world, but maybe to prevent it and to think about it. And I will not develop all the aspects of this book. So this point is exactly what I wanted to say. If our society is so prone to epileptic seizures today, I think that it is because it reached an unprecedented potentiality of consciousness. And this one is a good news for me, because we did not reach such a level before. And I will just take the, one illustration for sake of time. If you pay attention and try to think about it, the case of communication tools, okay? And as I said before, the societal loss of consciousness, the most extreme form being the totalitarian regime, for instance, Nazism or communism in Sovietism, etc. What is interesting is that these regimes corresponded also to high-level technology for this time. So the first highways, like you know, were built in Mussolini's fascist Italy. Fascism is like the highway. You are propagating one place to another place. The high development of train communication, of TV, of media, was also some mandatory tools, both for consciousness, but for this extreme form of societal loss of consciousness. So let's focus just a few minutes on case of communication tools, cultural communication. So interestingly, we moved, I think, according to this analogy, and I have the brain inside also as a way of analyzing that. We move from unidirectional, what we could call top-down tools. So you have high level of societies impriming or imposing some messages through unidirectional tools. Like, for instance, it can be positive, of course. When you have Émile Zola's paper for the Dreyfus case with the J'accuse, it moved not only in France, but all over the globe. It had a huge impact through this kind of unidirectional media. And of course, the radio theme, the TV also played in the same kind of thing. But then we have also bidirectional tools. And today, this bidirectional, top-down and bottom-up, engage in much more complex ways of circulating the information and enabling both unprecedented case of societal consciousness and loss of consciousness. And of course, when you move from the phone to the social networks, to the blogs, we have a lot of illustration of this added complexity due to the technology of communication. Yes, okay. So epilepsy, to go on with that. Epilepsy is avoidable, so it's not the case that you could not prevent it, that you could not find solutions to prevent it and to cure it, etc. And we could say that you can have, within this analogy, the possibility of projecting some equivalent of the treatment of the brain epilepsy to the societal epilepsy. And I propose some of these tracks of reflection or discussion, let's say. Epilepsy is a dynamic process. You are not freezing epilepsy. It's a period that are moving in the brain, but also in societies, I think, and it's curable. So I will try to then move to another part. Just last two things I wanted to tell you today. Another kind of consequence of this analogy. Again, we play this game and I try to repeat it because it's very important. When you want to play with an analogy, you have to be aware of what you are doing. And I will go back to that later on, but an analogy is not an identity. A brain is not a society. So you have to keep that in mind, that you are playing an analogy to let you find some new ideas and to make some links between different phenomena, but that are linked according to the properties you could isolate. And then you can move, like we try to do today, between the two levels. And the other, I think, caveats or trick or something that you want to avoid if you want to use analogy for knowledge is that analogy is not something done to freeze your thought. So you do not have to use analogy to impose a frightening message, or you do not have to use analogy, according to me. You do whatever you want, but I think we should not use analogy when we know from the beginning where we want to arrive. So what is interesting when you play with analogies is your discovery. I mean, you try to make some progression to see where it goes, and you try to think with it. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. So another consequence of this analogy that I want to discuss with you is that we have a lot of, I'm not an expert of society, but kind of one another phenomenon which is interesting me is that's what we could call the returns of religion. What I mean by a religion is not only the traditional religion. In a way, it's not even the God-related religion, but you have a lot of secular forms of religions or meditations or whatever you want, and from every place. So I think you have a lot of this kind of returns of religion in contemporary societies. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my observation without expertise in this field. And why do I mention that? Because as a neurologist, what I know, that if I go back to the illustration I showed you, I know something else that not only neurologists know, but also, of course, the patients and their relatives. When an epileptic seizure begins somewhere in your brain, in particular in the temporal lobe, which is the most common forms of epilepsy, so you have something very strange. You have a transient period that corresponds to the beginning of the seizure. So the seizure just began, like here. But still the patient is conscious, self-reporting to himself his subjective experience, what he feels, what he moves, what he thinks about, etc. But there is something special before the loss of consciousness, and sometimes the seizure will stop here. It's what we call an aura. Aura is like this strange, it's a very strange thing because for patients, they have a subjective experience which differs completely from the subjective experience they have when they are not epileptic. And most of the patients, they do recognize that aura. They know that they are the beginning of an epileptic seizure because they feel something special. In many occasions, this aura can have in the temporal, internal part of the temporal lobe, can have some emotional counterpart with either positive or negative symptoms. Sometimes you have a kind of hypersyntonia. You think that you are really part of the world, that you are really something you never experienced before. So I will not develop too much, but what I want to say is that we could ask, if we want to play this analogy again, so would there be a place in this analogy for the epileptic aura of neurology? So meaning the beginning of a seizure without losing consciousness, could we find a counterpart at the macrocosmic level of societies? And of course, if you put it this idea this way, you easily end up with this proposal that maybe this kind of societal level emotional phenomenon, supra-individual phenomenon, such as the returns of religions that we shortly mentioned, could be described here in this analogy as the epileptic aura of societies, not of individuals. And what is interesting is that in neurology, when a patient has an aura, you have two consequences. First, you can learn to recognize the aura, which plays a role of an alert, of an upcoming possible loss of consciousness if there is a propagation of the seizure. And so many patients find some tricks, some strategies, some cognitive postures, some ways or some medications to stop the epileptic seizure. So we can use the aura, not only in the brain, but in society, to prevent the loss of consciousness, both individual, but also, according to my analogy, in societies. And the second point, which is in a way even more interesting, when you analyze and you examine and you follow patients, many of these aura, because they are very strange experience, some things that you don't find in everyday life for patients, they can have some source, so they could correspond to a source of creativity for some patients. I will not cite here, when we give lessons to medical students in neurology, I like to cite Dostoevsky's citation about his epileptic seizures, the fact that this aura, he would not exchange that for nothing else in the world because it's a most rich subjective experience that inspires him, etc., etc. So just to say we have the 2 points, and in a way it could be interesting to analyze this aspect also for society. So I will be short of time soon. I have 5 minutes more to discuss with you, not to discuss, but so that's a good teaser. For a more detailed description and use of my analogy, either you can learn French, so l'homme raisonnable, and for those of you who read French or recognize l'homme raisonnable, the title here, so it means l'homme raisonnable, so that means the man, l'homme raisonnable, it's written not the correct way, it's like a homophony. Réseau is written network, so able to live in networks, but also can be rational or not. So is the man rational when he lives in networks or not? Between the two levels, the microcosm of the brain and the macrocosm of society. But actually with my wife, Karin, who is a writer, not a neuroscientist, but we live together, so she turned to be very familiar with a lot of ideas and concepts of neurology and neuroscience. Actually, we wrote a book that is translated in Spanish, De que hablamos cuando hablamos del cerebro. Of course, I invite you, and one of the chapters is dedicated to this analogy. So I will end up now just trying to put back the main idea of the analogy and to say that analogies, well beyond my talk, of course, you know that analogies are very useful. Actually, some people think that all we think is analogies. So analogies can help us to produce new perspectives and challenging problems, so to revisit, to observe challenging problems and to look them from outside the box, or to find some ways of describing or analyzing them differently. But please don't forget that an analogy is not an identification. As soon as you do that, I think that we would commit errors. Analogy is not identification, and you have that's maybe one of the single rules of the game. When I say rule, it's not an obligation, but for it to be useful and not to be misunderstood in a way. So again, a brain is not a society, but it still helps us to find some bridges, phenomenon, and some things that we could at least stimulate. And I hope that it could interest you, and maybe hopefully to send me some questions or commentaries. I would read them with pleasure, and maybe next time, so muchas gracias. Unfortunately, I don't speak Spanish, but el año que viene en la Ciudad de México. Yes, that's what we can wish, maybe for next year beyond this pandemic. So I thank you very much for your attention, your conscious attention, and I thank again the organizers of the wonderful ALEPH Festival. Thank you very much.